chaos.
Okay, I want you to picture this. The atmosphere is just thick, cold, and, well, it's utterly terrifying.
Right.
We are in the pre-dawn darkness. It's September 1st, 1983, and we're high over the Sea of Japan, just to the west of Sakhalin Island.
Below you, there's just black water. Nothing. And above, you've got a Soviet Su-15 interceptor, a fighter jet, flying this tight, really desperate pursuit pattern.
The pilot, his name is Gennady Osipovich, is closing in, and he's closing in fast on an aircraft that has just flown through some of the most sensitive, most heavily defended airspace on the entire planet.
I mean, it is the ultimate snapshot of the Cold War, right? The whole thing condensed into one single moment of decision.
And Osipovich, he throttles back. He draws his fighter to within 200 meters of this target. That is incredibly close.
Oh, unbelievably close. He's close enough to see specific details. He sees flashing strobe lights. He sees the navigation lights. And most crucially, he sees the unmistakable shape of a heavy transport aircraft.
He sees that iconic humped silhouette of a Boeing 747. And through the darkness, he later says he sees 2 rows of windows.
And while he's seeing this, the commander's back on the ground, whose voices we now have from these declassified transcripts, they sound taut, with agitation, with panic even.
They've already made their call.
They have. The command they broadcast directly to Osipovich in his cockpit is simple, it's uncompromising, and it is absolutely lethal.
Destroy the target.
And he does. He fires 2 air-to-air missiles. On board that Boeing 747, Korean Airlines flight Veveros 07, were 269 people, men, women, and children.
The fallout was it was instant and global. The West, led by the U.S., immediately called it a massacre, a crime against humanity.
And the Soviet Union was just as quick to fire back, calling it a provocation. They insisted, absolutely insisted, that this was a deliberate spy mission, a covert action by the Americans to test their defenses.
And this, right here, this brings us to the central, agonizing contradiction that we are here to unpack today in this deep dive.
It's a huge one.
Because decades later, the pilot, Osipovich himself, admitted something truly shocking. In an interview, he said, clearly, unequivocally, "I knew this was a civilian plane."
And when you hear that, you think, okay, case closed, it's murder.
Exactly. That sounds like the final verdict. But the critical context, the thing you have to understand, is the rest of his statement, the words that followed immediately after. He says, "For me, this meant nothing."
And that is the core nexus of this entire tragedy. How can a professional military pilot visually confirm he's targeting a commercial airliner full of windows and still pull the trigger?
To really understand what happened, we can't just accept the Soviet narrative or the American narrative in full. It's just not that simple.
No, we have to be forensic. Our mission here is to act like a prosecutor,
Yeah.
We need to examine 2 parallel lines of inquiry that the sources lay out for us. First, the overwhelming evidence for a catastrophic technical failure inside that 747.
And second, the equally powerful evidence of a panicked, lethal military decision that was driven by this intense geopolitical paranoia completely outside of it.
We have to see precisely where those 2 lines, the technical accident and the Cold War paranoia, where they intersect, because that's where the catastrophe happens.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start with the airliner itself. Because the sources, they present an incredibly compelling case that the root cause was something astonishingly mundane, yet catastrophic. It was a fundamental navigational mistake by the crew of KAL-007. So let's begin inside the cockpit of that 1980s era 747. To get this, you really need to understand the systems the crew was relying on for this massive long-haul flight, from Anchorage, Alaska, all the way to Seoul, Korea.
Right. And the key piece of technology here is something called the Inertial Navigation System, the INS.
What exactly was that? I mean, this is pre-GPS, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Way before GPS was a common thing. The INS was basically the cutting-edge way to fly long distances, especially over featureless areas like the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where you can't just, look down and see where you are or rely on ground-based radio beacons.
So how did it work?
The crew's job before takeoff was to input a long series of geographic coordinates. Pilots called them waypoints. And these waypoints, they define a very specific designated air corridor. For this particular route, it was known as Romeo 20. Think of it like programming a very complex route into your car's sat-nav today.
So once all those coordinates are loaded in, what happens next?
Well, once they're loaded and double-checked, the crew selects INS mode on the autopilot. This is a sophisticated automated mode. It's essentially telling the plane, Follow this pre-programmed curvilinear path exactly. Adjust for wind, adjust for magnetic variation, even the curvature of the Earth.
So the plane is basically locked onto this invisible highway in the sky?
That's the perfect way to put it, an invisible highway. It's supposed to be reliable, predictable, and totally automatic.
There's a vital, much simpler manual alternative, right? A sort of low-tech fallback.
Right, and it's called heading mode. This is just your basic compass setting. It ignores all those complex waypoints you just spent time entering into the INS. It simply tells the autopilot, fly on this one, single constant compass bearing, let's say 245 degrees magnetic, and just fly that in a straight line, indefinitely, until I tell you to do something else.
And the flight plan for 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 wasn't one or the other. It was a hybrid of the two, which you can already see is where the process started to go wrong.
Exactly. They were required to take off from Anchorage, fly a specific heading for a short time, maybe 10 minutes or so, just to clear the immediate airspace, avoid city restrictions, that kind of thing.
And then once they were clear,
Then they were supposed to manually transition the autopilot over to INS mode to capture that pre-programmed route, that invisible highway, Romeo 20.
and here we get to the core finding. The anchor of the whole technical investigation, confirmed by the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO, in their big, definitive 1993 report.
A huge report. And they used the recovered flight data recorder, the black box, and they concluded that that one crucial switch from the basic straight line heading mode to the complex curve tracking INS mode.
It just didn't happen right.
It never happened correctly.
So the plane was supposed to be following this gently creeping highway over the ocean, but instead, it was just flying in a dead straight line based on a single compass bearing.
Precisely. The crew either forgot to switch it over entirely or, and this is the key part, they tried to switch it over too late.
Right.
And this is where the specific design of the 1980s 747 INS system creates a devastating technical trap for that crew.
Okay, we need to spend a minute on this technical detail because it really defines why a tiny initial error became this massive fatal deviation. Let's talk about the 7.5-mile gate.
This is truly the silent killer in this whole story. The INS system was designed with what you could call a technical lockout. It was a programmed gate of 7.5 nautical miles.
What does that mean, a gate?
It means the system was programmed to only capture and follow the designated INS route if the aircraft was physically within 7.5 miles of that pre-programmed center line when the pilot selected the mode.
Okay, so there's a window of opportunity.
A very specific window. So let's say the pilots were supposed to switch to INS mode 10 minutes into the flight, but they got a little delayed. Maybe they were focused on radio checks, running through checklists, or just distracted for a moment, and they drifted 8 miles off that planned center line.
Just a half mile outside the gate. What happens then?
If they were 8 miles off, or even 7.6 miles off, the system would simply refuse to capture the route. It would silently reject the INS input.
Silently.
Silently. And this is the profound systemic flaw. The autopilot would then just stubbornly remain engaged in the last mode. It was in that simple straight line heading mode. And crucially, it would do so without triggering any warning light or any alarm or any bell in the cockpit.
That is an astonishing design flaw. It's like a computer program crashing. But instead of giving you an error message, it just keeps running your last command without telling you the new commands didn't even register.
That is a perfect analogy. The crew thought they were on the automated curving highway of the INS system. They'd pushed the button, they assumed it worked. But the autopilot was still just executing the last simple instruction they gave it. Fly straight on 245 degrees.
And 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 did just that.
It flew on that constant magnetic heading for 5.5 hours. Straight.
And this tiny, uncorrected error, just flying a straight magnetic line instead of the necessary geographic curve, it's just compounded and compounded over that huge distance. How far off track did this ultimately put them?
It was staggering. By the time they reached the interception point, that constant 245-degree heading had put the plane 300 miles. That's over 500 kilometers off course.
And that deviation took them directly over the Kamchatka Peninsula and then Sakhalin Island. These weren't just, random spots on the map.
Not at all. These were two of the Soviet Union's most heavily protected and sensitive military zones, housing key strategic nuclear submarine bases and early warning radar installations. The worst possible place to be lost.
So, okay. We've established a solid, documentable mechanism for how they ended up there. A known technical quirk coupled with, basic human forgetfulness. It's a very clean explanation.
It is.
But the Soviets insisted this was a deliberate spy plane. So the ultimate proof against that theory, it has to come from the people who are actually flying the plane.
Exactly. And that brings us to the most powerful single piece of evidence that this was a tragic accident, not an act of espionage. And that's the Cockpit Voice Recorder, the CVR.
Which the Soviets finally recovered from the seabed and released in 1993, right? A full decade after the event.
They did. And if this was a high-stakes, deliberate espionage mission, a provocation, as the Soviets repeatedly claimed, you'd expect that crew to be focused, tense, incredibly professional.
Every word would be clipped. Every checklist item confirmed twice. You'd hear that tension.
You'd hear the tension. But the CVR tapes revealed the absolute opposite. The ICAO analysts who studied them described hours of bantering and casual cockpit conversation.
They were just chatting.
They were completely relaxed. At one point, the co-pilot is heard joking about an in-flight meal he had. They're discussing the logistics of their layover when they get to Seoul.
We even know they discussed currency exchange rates, a detail that feels so banal, so everyday, that it just screams innocence.
It absolutely does. I mean, they weren't discussing surveillance targets or evasion maneuvers or secret code words. They were talking about how many Korean won they could get for their dollars. The tone was one of profound boredom and complacency.
Which is pretty typical for a long, routine, all-night flight over water.
Very typical. It's what pilots call the backside of the clock when your body wants to be asleep. This complete lack of tension on the CVR, it just fundamentally demolishes the idea of a focused, mission-oriented spy crew.
And the ICAO analysis in their official report, they didn't pull any punches when they described the crew's behavior, did they?
No, they didn't at all. The official conclusion stated that the conversations on the tape demonstrated a severe lack of situational awareness and flight deck coordination on the part of the crew.
In other words, they were just lost.
They were relaxed, they were comfortable, and they were completely, utterly oblivious to their situation. They were lost and not checking their instruments properly to realize it.
Did the CVR reveal anything else about their state of attention? Did they ever mention anything about, say, the weather radar or any unexpected landmarks on the ground?
And that's the other critical piece. No. There is no indication at any point that they cross-checked their primary navigational instruments, the INS they thought was working, with any secondary methods.
They just trusted the machine.
For 5 hours, they were relying solely on that silent, mistaken autopilot. The CVR is literally the sound of a crew that has set the system, leaned back, and just mentally checked out, assuming the machine was doing its job. This complacency, this sheer faith in the automation, it's the sound of an accident waiting to happen, not a spy plot unfolding.
But this still raises a huge question for a lot of people listening. I mean, how can highly trained professional pilots flying a massive aircraft full of hundreds of people be this careless? Is an error of this magnitude even plausible?
And that's a completely valid skepticism. But the sources we have confirm that it is, in fact, terrifyingly plausible. This specific type of failure is a documented issue in aviation history.
It's happened before.
Many times. A study was conducted using the NASA Aviation Safety Database, and it found over 100 reports of similar INS navigation errors.
Okay, but how many of those involved this exact failure cruise not realizing the autopilot was stuck in heading mode?
12 of them. It's a known trap. The report documents one flight, very similar to KL-07, that flew 250 nautical miles off track. 250 miles.
And when the crew was debriefed, what was their explanation?
They attributed the incident to exactly what you might expect on a long, dark flight over the ocean. Complacency, boredom, and fatigue. The KL-007 crew was facing the exact same set of human factor variables.
So complacency, which is really the polar opposite of espionage, is the established human factor here. But there was also a critical institutional failure, wasn't there? One that was specific to Korean Airlines at the time.
Absolutely. The sources really highlight this. KAL had failed to ensure their crews were adequately trained to use a fundamental safety tool they had right there in the cockpit with them, the weather radar.
They didn't know how to use their own radar.
They didn't know how to use it in one of its most important modes. They failed to teach the crews how to use it in ground mapping mode.
And what difference would that have made?
A massive life-saving difference. The weather radar doesn't just show you clouds and rain. In ground mapping mode, it acts like a high-resolution imaging system for anything solid underneath the plane. Land, coastlines, mountains. Had the crew performed even one routine check of the radar screen after flying for an hour or two, they would have seen the massive, unmistakable landmass of the Kamchatka Peninsula filling up the entire screen.
They would have instantly known they were hundreds of miles inland, not over the open Pacific Ocean.
Instantly. That image alone would have been an immediate screaming red flag, a sudden jolt back to reality.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, where are we?
But because they lacked that specific bit of training, that key safety barrier was completely bypassed.
It was. So the conclusion here, based on the flight data recorder, the CVR, and aviation precedent, is crystal clear. 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐓 was a human factors and technical failure accident.
A completely lost plane with the crew totally oblivious to its catastrophic deviation. But here is where the accident collides so fatally with history, because this clean, logical accident scenario happened at the absolute worst possible moment in the most highly protected Soviet airspace, and it coincided with the presence of a known U.S. spy plane. The coincidence, it was just utterly lethal. So let's pivot now. Let's shift our focus entirely to the Soviet perspective, because the technical failures of that KL crew fed perfectly into the deepest paranoia of the Soviet air defense system.
That's the key linkage. The Soviet Union absolutely 100% insisted the KL-007 was a deliberate provocation. They even used the term dummy selling tactic.
What does that even mean?
They believed the U.S. was using a civilian shell, a 747, to test the vulnerability and, more importantly, the response time of their air defenses, likely in preparation for future hostilities.
And we can't ignore the fact that fueled this paranoia. There really was a U.S. Air Force RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft operating in the area.
There was. It was flying its normal route just outside Soviet airspace at almost the exact same time that KL-007 was making its deep, unauthorized penetration into their airspace. The timing was just disastrous.
And this is where the technical failure of the Soviet equipment comes into play, isn't it? The core of their immediate justification, the reason they were so sure it was a spy plot, lies in what their radar operators claim they saw on their screens over Kamchatka.
That's right. They claimed that the radar blip of the known RC-135 spy plane and the new, unidentified blip, which we know was KL-007, came close, and most critically, merged for about 10 minutes.
Okay, so let's try to think about that from their perspective. From a paranoid Soviet mindset, what does that look like?
From their perspective, that is instantly interpreted as proof of a coordinated military maneuver. They assumed the RC-135, the known spy, had completed its intelligence gathering task and was then handing off its mission to the 747, the decoy.
A decoy that could now use its civilian status, its assumed diplomatic immunity, to fly over those highly sensitive Soviet military sites without being challenged.
Exactly. This single initial assumption, which they made within the first 30 minutes of tracking the target, it became the absolute foundation of their entire military response for the rest of the night.
The flawed observation that the blips merged.
That flawed observation contributed directly to the Soviet forces' unshakable conviction that the unidentified Echo was not a lost airliner, but a foreign military reconnaissance aircraft designed to look like one.
It's a powerful example of confirmation bias, really. They were already looking for a military provocation, and when the radar provided this ambiguous signal, this merging of the blips, they didn't assume their equipment was flawed, they assumed it was a conspiracy.
And this brings us back to that ICAO forensic analysis from 1993, which provides the critical rebuttal to the entire Soviet justification. We have to verify if those blips really did merge.
So what did the ICAO report, using all the available data from our sides, find about the actual flight paths of the RC-135 and KL-07?
The finding is definitive. The two aircraft were never, ever close. They were, and I'm quoting here, never closer than 75 nautical miles laterally.
75 nautical miles. That's an enormous separation.
It's huge. The idea of a coordinated, tight handoff in the sky, where one plane seamlessly transferred its mission to the next, is just physically impossible from that distance.
75 nautical miles is what, over 140 kilometers? It's not just a large gap. That's a failure of technology to resolve two different objects.
It is. And in fact, the Soviet Union's own data submission years later eventually admitted that the minimum lateral interval was actually closer to 150 kilometers.
So the merged blips were not evidence of espionage at all. They were evidence of a significant technical failure in the Soviet radar systems of the time.
That's it. These systems simply lacked the resolution capability necessary to distinguish two separate targets that far apart, especially when they were at the very edge of their operational range.
Can you explain that resolution failure a bit more? I mean, for a listener, why would two planes that are physically 75 miles apart look like a single morphing target on a screen?
Think of it like a very old, low-definition video screen, or maybe an early video game. When two complex objects are far away and near the edge of the screen, the display system just differs. It lacks the clarity the pixel density, to render them as two separate things.
So they just sort of blur together?
Exactly. The two distinct radar returns overlapped on the display screen, creating a single elongated blob that appeared to the operators to move smoothly from the RC-135's track right into the path of 𝐃𝐿O-007.
So the operators on the ground genuinely believed they saw a physical handoff, even though it never, ever happened.
They did. Their technical limitations reinforced their paranoia. And this leads to another huge technical and human failure in the Soviet chain of command. Even if the radar was flawed, the visual interception by the fighter pilot should have clarified everything before a single missile was fired.
Of course. They don't look anything alike.
Not even close. A Boeing 747 is 232 feet long with that unique hump for the upper deck. An RC-135, which is based on the smaller Boeing 707 airframe, is only 136 feet long. They are visually and physically distinct.
The failure of the system to correctly identify the target visually, even with the pilot just 200 meters away, suggests this enormous gap between standard procedure and what actually happened that night.
It does. So the entire spy plane theory, the sole justification for this aggressive, lethal response, was built on a technical failure of Soviet radar and a massive, tragic coincidence of timing.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question. Why the lethal response? Why didn't they follow international law, try to communicate, and force the plane to land? Why shoot?
To understand why the decision was lethal, you have to place this incident directly inside the military psychology of the Soviet Union in September 1983. This wasn't some routine intersection on a quiet Tuesday. This was an event unfolding during what many historians now regard as the most dangerous and tense year of the entire Cold War.
It's hard for us now, I think, to truly grasp the level of tension they were operating under. We tend to remember the Cold War as this long, frozen standoff, not a series of moments of imminent panic.
Well, 1983 was different. It was just a crucible of fear, suspicion, and miscalculation on both sides.
Let's start with the political rhetoric coming from the West. In March of 1983, President Ronald Reagan had delivered his famous Evil Empire speech. For the hardline Soviet leadership, especially the then leader Yuri Andropov, how was that speech interpreted?
It was perceived as far more than just political posturing. The Soviet military and intelligence apparatus, the KGB, genuinely believed that the U.S. was moving beyond rhetoric and was actively preparing for a first strike.
A surprise nuclear attack.
A surprise nuclear attack. They saw Reagan's words not as a speech, but as a strategic prelude to an actual war.
And in direct, desperate response to that deep-seated fear, the KGB initiated something called Operation Ryan.
Right. Ryan is the Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack. And this was not just another intelligence program. It was a mandate born of pure paranoia.
What was its purpose?
Ryan was a massive, unprecedented global intelligence gathering program with one single obsessive purpose: to detect the final, immediate prelude to this surprise nuclear attack from the West. They had agents looking for any deviation from the norm.
Like what?
Increased lights on in the Pentagon late at night, changes in diplomatic radio traffic, unusual troop movements in Europe, moving blood supplies to military hospitals. Every single tiny anomaly was viewed as a potential indicator that the bombs were about to fly.
This must have created a systemic environment of just hypervigilance among all military commanders.
Hypervigilance is the perfect word. So when 𝐃𝐿-007, a lost airliner, appears on their radar, penetrating their air defenses and coincidentally flying near a known RC-135 spy plane, it was immediately slotted into that Ryan framework.
It was seen as confirmation of their worst fears.
It wasn't a mistake. It was the provocation they were actively looking for. They thought it was designed to stretch their resources, draw out their interceptors, and test their radar blind spots right before the main event. The entire system was primed to see an existential threat, and 𝐃𝐿-007 fulfilled that terrible expectation perfectly.
And we can hear this paranoia, this panic, directly in the declassified ground control tapes from the Soviet military command centers near Sakhalin Island. This wasn't a calm, coordinated professional operation. It sounds frantic.
It was pure chaos, and it was amplified by earlier failures that night. Over the Kamchatka Peninsula, the first attempt to intercept 𝐃𝐿-007 had failed completely.
And the sources confirm a shocking reason why.
Yes. The MiG-23 interceptors they sent up were deliberately underfueled.
Why would a military deliberately underfuel its own defense aircraft, especially during the most dangerous time of the Cold War?
It was a security measure against their own pilots. In 1976, a Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko had famously defected by landing his top-secret MiG-25 fighter in Japan. After that, the Soviet leadership mandated severe fuel restrictions on their interceptors to prevent another pilot from having enough fuel to make it to a foreign country.
So their institutional paranoia about their own people directly undermined their ability to perform their primary mission of air defense.
Precisely. And that failure to intercept successfully over Kamchatka just ratcheted up the tension and the pressure on the commanders who were now responsible for Sakhalin Island. It essentially made them desperate not to fail again.
And the transcripts show this. They show General Valery Kamensky and his subordinate, General Anatoly Kornikov, arguing intensely.
They were. And they were running out of time, the aircraft was traveling fast, and it was about to exit Soviet airspace again. They knew if it left, they would lose face, and potentially, in their Rhine-driven worldview, they would have allowed a critical military objective to be completed by the enemy.
What was the specific mindset of Kornikov? He seems to be the one who really drove the final decision.
Kornikov was acting entirely on that flawed, merged blips data and the overwhelming paranoia of the time. He was convinced, beyond any doubt, that this target was a military spy plane. He was the one who was pushing for the immediate shoot-first approach.
Because he was afraid if they tried to force it down.
He was afraid the military plane would just accelerate, punch through their airspace, and make a mockery of their defense.
Were they even debating the possibility that it could be a civilian transport?
They were, but only briefly. The pressure of the clock ticking down, the weight of Operation Ryan's mandate, it was just too much. The political culture at the time demanded immediate, decisive action against any perceived threat. So the final, desperate, rushed decision was made.
Destroy the target.
An order born of deep systemic fear and fatally flawed intelligence, overriding any momentary doubt they might have had.
To really, truly comprehend the danger levels that led to this shootdown, we need to zoom out just slightly and look at an event that happened just 2 months after 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 was destroyed, because this provides terrifying context for just how razor-thin the margin for error was in 1983.
We're talking about a NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83.
Right.
This was a command and control drill, basically simulating the transition from conventional warfare to a full-blown nuclear conflict in Europe. And critically, the sources confirmed this exercise was designed to be hyper-realistic.
How realistic are we talking about here?
Well, they simulated using top-secret code words. They practiced getting high-level diplomatic clearances. They even involved heads of government like Margaret Thatcher. They were practicing the exact communication procedures that would be used in an actual nuclear release.
And for the Soviet intelligence network under Operation Ryan, which was tasked with watching for exactly this kind of escalation,
for them, Able Archer looked like the real deal. It looked like the final dress rehearsal, or maybe even the beginning of the surprise attack they had been expecting all year.
So this exercise, which NATO intended as a way to test their own systems and deter the Soviets, was actually perceived by the Ryan apparatus as the attack itself.
That's precisely right. And we now know from declassified documents that the Soviet military reacted with unprecedented alarm. Units in East Germany and Poland were ordered to move to the highest state of combat readiness. Specific orders were given to ground-launched missile units to make preparations for the immediate use of nuclear weapons.
The world came that close to a nuclear war because of a training exercise.
Frighteningly close. Able Archer proved that the Soviet military had zero confidence in its ability to distinguish a drill from a genuine attack. It proved that the Ryan paranoia wasn't just high-level rhetoric, it was operationalized systemic fear.
And this is the essential contextual takeaway for 𝐃𝐈-007. When that airliner appeared on September 1st, 1983, penetrating Soviet airspace and coinciding with the movement of an American spy plane, the commanders at Sakhalin were not operating under normal circumstances.
Not even close.
They were operating in the context of Ryan, knowing full well that their superiors in Moscow believed the U.S. was preparing for a first strike at any moment.
The lost airliner, the technical error, the coincidence, all of it was processed through a system that was primed by institutional fear to perceive only the worst-case scenario. It was seen as a deliberate test, a soft opening for a larger aggression. The system was simply incapable of processing the possibility of a benign human mistake.
This tragic collision of an impersonal technical accident with the systemic historical paranoia would be the complete story. A convergence of system failures leading to tragedy. But there is one final agonizing piece of evidence we have to confront: the pilot's own testimony.
The tragedy gains this final, devastating layer of human culpability when we return to the pilot in the cockpit, Gennady Osipovich. We have to reconcile all these system failures with the final act of a single man pulling a trigger.
Let's start with the official narrative that the USSR immediately constructed to try and shield itself from the global outrage. What did they claim about the shootdown right after the event?
They were absolutely desperate to portray the target as hostile and evasive. Their official story was that they had fired warning shots with tracer shells and that the plane had been flying dark with no navigation lights on.
So the narrative was, we tried everything to warn them, but this spy plane refused to acknowledge any of our warnings.
That was the story. But 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄, years later, directly contradicted every single element of that official lie.
He did, didn't he?
He did. Once the Cold War was over and he started giving interviews, he explicitly debunked the entire Soviet cover story. He stated flatly that his plane had no tracer rounds, which meant the idea of visible warning shots was physically impossible.
And he confirmed what U.S. intelligence intercepts had already suggested about the plane's lights.
Yes, he confirmed that he could clearly see the 747's flashing strobe lights and its navigation lights. The plane was fully lit up, following all the international rules for civil aviation.
So the official story was that the plane was warned, dark, and evasive. The reality was it was oblivious, fully lit, and received no effective warning.
And this leads us to the most chilling part of his subsequent testimony, the part that seems to indict him completely.
He gave us that one unequivocal statement that brings the raw human element right back into the center of this.
He stated, and I'm quoting him directly, "I was just next to him, on the same altitude. I saw 2 rows of windows and knew that this was a Boeing. I knew this was a civilian plane."
When you hear that, it sounds like murder.
The ground commanders, maybe you can argue they were acting on faulty intelligence, but the pilot, the man who executed the order, he had visual confirmation of a commercial aircraft carrying people. It feels like the ultimate verdict on the physical confirmation. It seems so clear. But we have to dig deeper into the psychology of that specific moment.
And this is where we have to connect the pilot's visual confirmation, seeing the window, seeing the Boeing hump, with the systemic paranoia we just talked about. What was the rest of his testimony? The part that defined his internal logic.
His critical full quote was, "I knew this was a civilian plane, but for me this meant nothing. It is easy to turn a civilian type of plane into one for military use."
And that is the core paradox. He didn't see 269 innocent passengers. He saw a physical object, a Boeing 747, which he was psychologically conditioned by decades of Cold War suspicion and Ryan paranoia to believe was a cunningly disguised military threat.
His confirmation bias was absolute. He visually confirmed the plane's physical Type A 747, and that physical confirmation was immediately processed by his brain as proof of military deception.
He saw the evidence of its civilian nature as proof of its military purpose.
Exactly. He insisted until the day he died that the plane was nothing more than a military spy craft in a civilian shell, and that it contained no passengers aboard.
So the very visual evidence that you or I would interpret as proof of innocence, the passenger windows, was interpreted by him as proof of military sophistication and betrayal.
Precisely. The Soviet propaganda, the failure of their radar intelligence, and the systemic existential fear of the early 1980s had created this reality distortion field for 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄. His visual confirmation that it was a 747 overrode any common sense because the system had taught him that a 747 was a perfect cover for a spy mission.
Did he ever consider the profound human implications of seeing those windows?
The evidence suggests that, in the heat of that moment, under intense pressure from ground command, the systemic belief in the provocation rendered the human elements completely invisible to him. He saw windows, but he did not see people. He saw an official military target that had to be destroyed before it escaped.
Which brings us to the final, fatal failure in the safety chain. If he saw the distinct hump and the 2 rows of windows, why didn't he radio that critical information down to the commanders on the ground? Why didn't he just say, "General, this is clearly a commercial airliner, I see passenger windows"? Was he under orders not to question the target type?
He wasn't explicitly ordered not to question it, but the entire environment was clearly hostile to any doubt. And here's what the sources show. 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 did not report the specific visual identification that would have changed the outcome, the presence of those passenger windows and the 747 silhouette.
Why the silence on that key detail?
He was completely focused on executing the command before the target left the area. Instead of challenging the target's classification, he simply confirmed that the object in front of him matched the general description of the target he'd been sent to destroy, which was a large foreign reconnaissance aircraft.
He had been sent to destroy an intruder, not to make a diplomatic verification.
That was his mindset. So he maneuvered his jet, fired his 2 missiles, One hit the engines, the other hit the fuselage, and the plane began its slow, agonizing 12-minute descent into the sea. The final human check, the pilot's ability to use his own eyes to override flawed orders, was broken by his own unshakable belief that he was fighting a decisive battle against a disguised enemy.
So when we synthesize all the evidence that we'd unpacked today, we're left not with a simple act of murder or a simple accident, but with a massive, terrifying cascade of systemic failures, both internal to the plane and external in the military response.
Internally, we know the plane was lost due to a documented technical system error, that silent 7.5-mile gate flaw, and a profound 5-hour-long lack of situational awareness.
And the crew was oblivious. They were complacent, and they were in no way co-conspirators in a spy plot, a fact proven by that mundane, banal bantering on the cockpit voice recorder.
And externally, the Soviet air defense was operating in a state of what you can only call institutional existential paranoia. It was driven by the 1983 war scare and the desperate intelligence mandate of Operation Ryan.
They acted decisively, but on fundamentally flawed radar data. The merged blips were a technical resolution failure, not an espionage plot. And they were propelled by commanders who were convinced they were stopping an imminent military provocation right before their window of opportunity closed for good.
Which brings us back to that central, painful question. Did they shoot knowing? The ground commanders did not know the aircraft was civilian. They acted on false, highly biased intelligence, believing it was a military decoy.
But the pilot, Osipovich, he knew the plane's physical type. He saw the 747 and the windows. But he was so psychologically conditioned by his government and the geopolitical climate to interpret that physical type as a disguised and therefore highly dangerous military threat.
His sight was perfectly clear, but his judgment was completely blinded by fear.
The Korean Airlines Flight 007 tragedy was not the result of a single clean error. It was a perfect, terrible storm, a technical system that allowed a minor navigational slip to compound into a 300-mile deviation.
A human system that allowed professional pilots to neglect their primary safety checks for 5 straight hours.
And most tragically, a political military system so profoundly consumed by mutual distrust and paranoia that when it saw a lost airliner full of people, it was systematically and structurally incapable of perceiving anything other than a target.
And this raises a really important question for you to consider as you reflect on this history. When systems, both technical and governmental, are engineered under conditions of high tension and fear, which is the greater threat to our safety, a mistake made by a complacent, fallible human crew, or the absolute, unquestioning certainty of a system that is primed by institutional fear to always perceive the worst-case, most lethal threat. If the system demands immediate certainty in a world full of ambiguity, the consequence will almost inevitably be tragedy.